Welcome to the 30th meeting of the Standing Committee of Canadian Heritage. And of course, we left off at the last meeting. There was an adjournment put forward by Mr. Shields. Therefore, we go follow the dots. We go back to clause by clause consideration. Now, before we do that, I would like to point out that I see a multitude of hands in the air. So therefore, I'm going to take this in order. Ms. Harder.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it may be a surprise to you, but I am going to move that we now proceed to debate on the motion that was moved by MP Harder on Friday, April 30th.
The one as amended.
The one as amended, yes. Now,
Indeed.
I do believe that when debate ended, there was another amendment on the floor, but of course, the debate resumes where with only the amendments that were accepted.
You are correct. Let's get right to it since it's a dilatory motion. Madam Clerk, for the vote, please.
Sir, thank you very much. So, going to proceed to the harder motion. Mr. Housefather. Mr. Housefather?
Yes.
Madame Lalonde?
Yes.
Mr. Bruson?
Yes.
Ms. Ian?
Yes.
Mr. Maloney?
Yes.
Ms. Harder?
Yes.
Mr. Aitchison?
Yes.
Mr. Shields?
Yes.
Mr. Waugh?
Yes.
Mr. Champoux?
Oui.
Ms. McPherson?
Yes.
$11 yeas.
Okay, folks, I did not get a chance to say this at the beginning, but I just want everyone to know for the point of proceeding with this debate, I ask that you please try not to talk over each other. I really try my best to make sure that Hansard is able to recognize who is speaking. On top of the fact that we are in a virtual world, this is very difficult. And I ask that if you want to be involved, please do not shout into your microphone. If you feel your electronic hand is enough, you can wave at the screen if you wish. But when you yell into the microphone, somebody's ear is right there, and they are interpreters. And this isn't an easy world for them to be wading through. So we do have, yes, the amended motion on the floor, and we do have an amendment put forward by Madame de Bruzen, which is where we left off last time. Okay, Madame de Bruzen.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, point of order. Does it not go back to the mover of the motion?
My understanding is it goes back to where we left off. I believe she had the floor. I'm going to get Amy for clarification on this one.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Clerk.
Yes, sir. If you'd like to give me just one moment, I'll find the actual page number and I will get that right back to you.
Okay. In the meantime, I hope everybody's doing well. I mean, in this virtual world that we live in, it's great to see everybody, by the way. It's very good to see you. This is late in the evening for us here on this happy little island we call Newfoundland. And I'm so happy to see everybody. It's just fantastic. Yeah. This goes back to the days when I auditioned for a Vegas act several years ago. It never worked out for me, so I became a politician instead. I have no idea how to fill this gap. As you can see, I'm failing at it miserably. I see Mr. Manley is there. Mr. Manley, did you have a chance to do a sound check?
I did not have a chance to do a sound check. Would you like me to do a song and dance to fill this time?
I would like that.
Yes,
Okay,
I'm sure we would. You know what? I'm going to have to call on division on that one.
Yeah.
As interested as we may be, I may have to call back the clerk to
I assume it meant that
do
we
a
would be
sound check.
putting these.
1 second, everybody. 1 second. 1 second. I hear a lot of voices, folks. Everyone on mute, please. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, now Let's go. Mr. Manley, we're going to have to do their sound check on the fly. Madam Clerk, how are we doing?
Sir, would you prefer that I
No,
would you prefer that I
we'll
give
just
the
go straight
procedural
to
advice or the
debate.
sound check?
I think we might as well go straight to debate. And when Mr. Manley comes up, we'll try to do the sound check as it occurs in
Understood.
real time.
The answer is that it usually takes the debate usually resumes from the point where it was left, which would be the last point that we were at was where Ms. DeBrusen's amendment was on the floor.
Okay. Ms. DeBrusen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I am actually going to start by seeking unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment. And the reason that I say that is that I believe that there are some important pieces that we need to be able to move to be able to review this entire bill and to see the amendments that we are going to be coming to as part of the clause by clause. And I think that that's an important piece that we really need to do. So one thing as a point of clarity, I would like to seek unanimous consent, and then depending on that result, I would like to go on further to talk about what some of the issues are that I think are important for this debate.
Thank you, Mr. Brusen. Let's get to that right away. And of course, just for clarification, everyone, what Mr. Brusen is asking for is unanimous consent to withdraw her amendment. We all remember her amendment. It's been shared by the clerk, so we don't have to go over that. If I get someone dissenting, please say no. But does Mr. Brusen have unanimous consent to withdraw her amendment?
No.
No.
Okay.
Following through on debate, carry on.
Well, thank you. And that's unfortunate because there's a lot that we need to get to as part of this clause by clause study of Bill C-10. And I would like to be able to see us move to it because there are some important amendments that I will be moving forward once we get to clause by clause. For example, one of the amendments that I think is important for all of us to be discussing and getting to and voting upon will be an amendment that Bill C-10 in clause 7 be amended by A, adding after line 31 on page 7 the following, which would be I.1 in relation to online undertakings that provide a social media service, the discoverability of Canadian creators of programs, and B, adding after line 10 on page 8 the following 3.1
Point of
orders
order,
made.
Mr. Chair.
One
Sir.
moment. Okay, a point of order, Mr. Aitchison.
I'm confused, which is not an uncommon state. Is Mr. Brusen discussing her amendment that's on the floor, or is she proposing new amendments?
Well, she's not proposing, from what I can glean thus far, she's not proposing an amendment per se yet. She's talking about her current amendment in that particular context. Like I say, she's not moving anything at this point, but we're free and open to debate, and I'm going to let her proceed. Thank you, Mr. Aitchison.
Thank you. 3.1 orders made under this section other than orders made under paragraph 1E.2, I1, or J do not apply in respect of programs that are uploaded to an online undertaking that provides a social media service by a user of the service with a dash if that user is not the provider of the service or the provider's affiliate or the agent or mandatory of either of them with another dash for transmission over the internet and reception by other users of the service. And this amendment would go to restricting the CRTC's order powers for social media web giants to expenditures, discoverability of Canadian creators of programs, and financial information for these web giants. But the other part that's really important to be considering, and another amendment that I'm really looking forward to move once we get to clause by clause, is going to be another amendment that is in respect of Bill C-10 in clause 8 be amended by adding after line 8 on page 10 the following. 4. Regulations made under this section, other than regulations made under paragraph 1I or J, do not apply with respect to programs that are uploaded to an online undertaking that provides a social media service by a user of the service, if that user is not the provider of the service or the provider's affiliate or the agent or mandatory of either of them, for transmission over the internet and reception by other users of the service. And this amendment would be limiting the CRTC's regulatory powers for social media web giants to business information and registration.
Point of order.
And so I think it's very important that we...
Point of order. One second, Mr. Brusen. I'm going to ask you to hold on 1 second. Ms. Harder, point of order.
Thank you. I believe that there's a motion that is at hand, and then there's an amendment that is being made to that. I believe that those are the things that are supposed to be discussed right now. And right now the member is talking about a future amendment, not the current amendment that she would be wishing to make to my motion, which is currently being discussed.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Harder, for the intervention. Okay, so what's happening here, and I'm looking for Mr. Brusen's, you're not moving a motion right now.
I am not. This is part of the debate as to why I believe my amendment is there and why we need to move forward.
That's fine. The only thing I caution everyone, let's try to keep this on track. It's hard to follow as is in this type of world that we live in because, it's virtual and all those things, and we have several amendments on the move. I appreciate the fact that you're not moving a motion right now. You're talking about further debate, but let's try to keep it to as narrow as we can towards what we're debating. So, Ms. DeBrusen, once again, you have the floor.
Thank you. And I won't take much longer. I just thought it was very important that I put that out there because these amendments have been circulated by the clerk to all of the parties so that they could reflect on it as we debate the amendments, the motion that's been put forward by Ms. Harder, and really kind of highlights, I believe, the importance of moving through to clause by clause, because it's important that we do have a fuller picture of what this bill will look like once it's complete, if we are going to be putting it forward for a charter review, that there be all of the amendments and a full bill rather than a partial bill being put forward. So that was my addition to the debate. And I would suggest that if we could put it then maybe to a vote to have my amendment withdrawn.
Okay, just so that we're clear, we already sought unanimous consent. That did not happen. So we're currently still at your original amendment that we left with on Friday. Ms. Harder.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, maybe I'll just back up here for a moment because I think we seem to have forgotten what motion we're discussing. The motion that we're discussing is one that is necessary because section 4.1, clause 3 of Bill C-10, the bill being discussed, was removed. And because this section was removed from the bill, it therefore presents the question of, is this bill still compliant with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? That is the question at hand. And so that question can be answered in one way, and that is allowing this bill in its current state to go before the Justice Minister and the Justice Department for a charter review. At which point then a charter statement would be granted to the committee, and that charter statement would tell us whether or not it is charter compliant. If the Minister of Justice says yes, it is, with section 4.1 missing, then we proceed accordingly. However, if the Justice Minister says that no, this bill with missing 4.1 is not compliant with the Charter, then it's incumbent upon us as members of this committee to pause and make the necessary changes to this bill to ensure that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is in fact respected, that Canadians' freedoms are honored. The motion that I have put forward then asks for that charter statement to be redone and to be provided to this committee. That's the motion that we are discussing. In order to get that charter statement, it would mean that committee needs to be paused where it's at right now. Now, while it is paused and we seek that charter statement, my motion suggests that we ask the Minister of Canadian Heritage and the Minister of Justice to appear before the committee. The amendment that the honourable member has made to my motion would suggest that the Minister of Canadian Heritage and the Minister of Justice do not come to this committee, but rather simply provide a written statement. Her amendment further suggests that instead of pausing right now in order to seek that renewed charter statement, that we would continue to debate a flawed piece of legislation, and then we would seek that charter statement at the end. I would suggest that that is a misuse of our time, given that many experts have already spoken out and would suggest, have argued that this bill is deeply flawed. But one of the things that the party in government presents to us over and over and over again when we ask questions in the House of Commons concerning this piece of legislation, they often say that individual users are protected. Meanwhile, Conservatives contend that that's not entirely the case now that that section 4.1 has been removed from the bill. Now, when the governing party argues this, they point to section 2.1. Now, 2.1 does say that users who upload programs onto social media sites like Facebook or YouTube or TikTok are not considered broadcasters, and so are not personally subject to conditions like the Canadian content requirements or the Canadian Media Fund contributions that would be imposed by the CRTC on streaming services like Netflix or Amazon, for example. That's fair. However, section 4.1 dealt with the programs, the content that individuals, you, me, your uncle, your aunt, your mom, upload to social media sites. And that 4.1 originally protected those individuals, their content, from being regulated by the CRTC. When we removed section 4.1, when that section was removed from the bill, that protection for the content that individuals place on social media platforms was therefore taken away. So, although the CRTC can't treat users, individuals, as broadcasters because of 2.1, with 4.1 gone, it can regulate the content, your mom's video, my mom's video, your uncle's video. It can regulate that content that is uploaded onto social media and perhaps even apps. And so then individuals, their content is treated as if it's the same as CTV News or Global, which is wrong, So let's just take a moment here, because again, there seems to be some confusion in the room. We seem to be discussing 2.1 as if it does what 4.1 once did. It's just not true. 2.1 is not the level of protection that Canadians deserve. It's not enough. We need section 4.1. We need that section that was taken out. Again, this is what I'm contending for. This is what many experts have said, but my motion would ask for an official opinion in the form of a charter statement. Now, let's go back here a moment. Just how could the CRTC regulate social media with clause 4.1 removed? Because that seems to be the issue at hand here. Well, using the powers in the Broadcasting Act, which is, again, the point of 4.1, these powers, particularly in sections 9.1, 9.11, and 10.1, could provide the basis for the CRTC, among other things, to adopt regulations that would require social media sites like YouTube to take down content that it considers offensive, and discoverability regulations, as Ms. DeBruzen used this term, that would make them change their algorithms to determine which videos are seen more or which videos are seen less. And the fines for violating these regulations could
Point
be
of
as
order.
high as.
Point of order.
One moment, please. Okay, sorry, Ms. Harder. Sorry, Mr. Housefather, was that you?
Yes, it was, Mr. Chairman. I would like to ask the question of relevance. This is related perhaps to the intention of the original motion. It is unrelated to Ms. DeBruzen's amendment that's now on the floor. There is no link whatsoever between this and what Mr. DeBruzen proposes an amendment.
Okay, folks, I'm just going to say this right now, and hopefully this clears up a lot. I like to give people a fair amount of latitude as to where you can go on this. But as much as I encourage you at times to think outside the box, you can't wander outside the warehouse and start drifting off into other places that we don't really need to be, given the fact that we are very focused here on a motion with its consequential amendment. So that being said, Ms. Harder, I give you the floor again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The point is that with section 4.1 removed, it does allow the CRTC to regulate the content that an individual might post on their YouTube channel or their Facebook page or a TikTok video that they might put up. Now, I have stated that I am contending for this. I'm contending for a new charter statement. Ms. DeBruzen has put forward the amendment that we don't do that until the end of the bill. I believe that it is absolutely essential now because of the detriment or the damage that can be done to individuals and their ability to speak freely within what we now call the new public square, which is social media. And because that impact is so severe, we have to stop now and consider whether or not this is actually in alignment with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, particularly with Section 2B, which of course protects thought, belief, opinion, expression. Now, that is what I'm contending for. But there are many experts who would also contend for this, who would say, whoa, this bill in its current state goes too far. And it is incumbent then upon the members of this committee to push the pause button and to seek a legal opinion. That legal opinion comes in the form of a charter statement. I'm talking about Professor Michael Geist. I'm talking about Emily Laidlaw, the former CRTC Commissioner Peter Menzies. I'm talking about many, many individuals.
Point of order.
Mr. Housefather.
Relevance. Mr. DeBruzen's amendment does not speak to removing the charter statement that is being requested, and now we're debating whether a charter statement is required or not.
Right. Oh, okay. Folks, I like to ask everyone again. I don't want to make judgment calls each and every time this happens. Just when I say to someone that you can think outside the box a bit, I'm going to still provide some of that leniency, but I'm asking everyone here to focus on what's at hand. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't realize that the supposed motions that could possibly be brought forward in order to amend this bill were relevant. Meanwhile, the things that I'm talking about are in the bill as it currently stands, and somehow Mr. Housefather doesn't find them relevant. I'll continue. I believe the voices of experts are worth hearing, that they are worth tuning into. And so as we consider my motion and as we consider the amendment to the motion, which would try to put a pause to what I'm asking for, I would like to show why it is urgent that we do in fact seek this renewed charter statement. In the charter statement, originally, it directly cites the social media exemption in its argument that the bill respects Section 2B of the Charter. Now, because that section has been removed from the bill, then it can be argued and should be argued that the bill no longer holds up to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Experts are warning of this. They are warning that with the amendments to the bill, that it could give too much power to the CRTC in order to regulate or control what we put on our social media pages. Again, an infringement on our charter rights under Section 2B, an infringement on our freedom, and therefore, I would say a thwarting of our ability to engage in what is now the public square. And that's wrong. Former CRTC Commissioner Peter Menzies said, I quote, Bill C-10 doesn't just infringe on free expression, it constitutes a full-blown assault upon it and through it, the foundations of democracy. That's a pretty big statement. That's a really big statement. It doesn't just infringe on free expression, it constitutes a full-blown assault upon it and through it, the foundations of democracy. That's big. That seems reason for moving to a charter statement immediately rather than waiting for several weeks. Furthermore, Laura Tribe, Executive Director of Open Media, had this to say. She said, voting for Bill C-10 in its current form will give the government the power to regulate speech on the internet. C-10 was supposed to be about supporting artists and creators, but this bill has totally lost the plot. Now that's interesting because in the House of Commons in question period, the minister states, or the Prime Minister has stated numerous times, and the Minister of Heritage continuously states that that is what this bill is about, that it's about supporting artists and those who create content. But actually, artists are able to exist and thrive when their Charter of Rights and Freedoms are most protected. So if we move forward with this bill in its current state, and it does in fact breach the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, then actually it's not helping artists and those who are creative. It's actually applying greater restrictions to them. It's hindering them from being the creative beings that they are meant to have the ability to be. It's actually inhibiting their ability to put content out there that they would wish to put out there. So no, this doesn't support struggling artists as the government would want Canadians to think. Now, Ms. Tribe goes on to say, for a country that made a department dedicated to, quote, innovation, it's amazing to watch how regressive, overreaching, and oppressive their policies have become. This government is a straight up disaster for Canada's internet. James Turk, the director of the Centre for Free Expression at Ryerson University, he said, the Trudeau government is planning to give the CRTC the right to regulate user-generated content on sites like YouTube by amending Bill C-10, a dangerous government overreach that must be stopped. Timothy Denton, who was a former national commissioner at the CRTC from 2009 to 2013. He said this: "The freedom to communicate across the internet is to be determined by political appointees on the basis of no other criterion than what is conducive to broadcasting policy and, presumably, the good of our domestic industry. As
Point of
always,
order.
the interests of the beneficiaries of
Point of order.
regulation."
Okay, one moment. Mr. Housefather, point of order.
Mr. Chairman, I would again come back to the fact that this is entirely unrelated to Mr. Brusen's amendment. We are now speaking to Mr. Brusen's amendment. I appreciate the
Housefather.
latitude, but this is now going
Mr. Housefather,
far afield.
when she started talking about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, of which Ms. de Brusen's amendment at the very first paragraph eliminates in its entirety, right? Now, I'm sorry, but I'm going to let her finish with what she just said. But I'd like to ask Ms. Harder, I don't know where she's going with the testimony of the person that she just brought up, but try to keep it within the confines of what you see is Ms. de Brusen's amendment contained. Thank you very much, Ms. Harder.
Since I got interrupted, let me re-begin with that quote. "The freedom to communicate across the internet is to be determined by political appointees on the basis of no other criterion than what is conducive to broadcasting policy and, presumably, the good of our domestic industry. As always, the interests of the beneficiaries of regulation are heard first, best, and last. Consumers and individual freedoms count for little when the regulated sector beats its drums. For the narrow clique of broadcasters, canon producers, and their lobbyists, it is always all about broadcasting. For Canadians, however, it is about the right to use the internet to communicate. We do not need to have our freedom of speech squelched by a government determined to protect an obsolete industrial structure. Forget about broadcasting. C10 is clearly intended to allow speech control at the government's discretion. Ignore the turn signals, look at where the wheels are pointed. They are pointed at your right to communicate freely by means of the internet." Dwayne Winsick, who is a professor, School of Journalism at Carleton University, director of the Canadian Media Concentration Research Project. He states, "I support the idea that online video on demand, OVOD, services can be regulated, as Bill C10 contemplates. But the bill was already a mishmash of dishonest representations of OVOD services as broadcasting. They are not. Proposed amendments adopted unanimously at the committee would drop that distinction and sweep user-generated content under the new Broadcasting Act. A terrible idea, not least because it subjects individual expression to the greatest low. Without these guide rails, the disc of C10 is being driven by lobby groups and think tanks tied to incumbent telecom and media industries' interests, and the Liberal government and tiny group of academics poorly versed in the terrain they seem to have gained unwarranted authority to speak on." Emily Laidlaw, Canada Research Chair in Cybersecurity Law and Associate Professor of Law at the University of Calgary. She has this to say: "While broadcasting regulations used to be about programming related to all our favorite TV shows, news, sports, it would now cover that home video of your kid winning a track meet that you uploaded to YouTube. Here's the free speech problem. Bill C10 forces social media companies to censor speech. While you might think, hey, it's a cesspool and we should clean that up, remember, this is broadcasting regulation, not all the other regulatory questions about online harms, platform power, or data protection. Why does it force social media companies to be censors? Because of the regulation it requires. The only option to comply with Bill C10 is for social media to heavily regulate content. She goes on to say, I am genuinely shocked by this. What does subjecting individual YouTube videos to CRTC regulation achieve in terms of regulatory objectives? These kinds of blunt approaches wreak havoc on internet governance, especially through a human rights-centered lens. Again, I would draw this committee's attention to her very important words there. Human rights-centered lens. Here in Canada, our rights are largely guided by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And that charter under section 2B, and I have a copy just in case. Now, Mr. Housefather, please don't call a point of order. It's just the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Says this, everyone has the following fundamental freedoms. A, freedom of conscience and religion. B, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. Interesting. C, freedom of peaceful assembly, and D, freedom of association. Let me draw your attention to B again, which of course is the subject at hand. Freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. This is our charter. This is our charter. This is Canadians' charter. This is the document that was put in place by the former Trudeau in order to protect our rights and our freedoms as Canadians. The responsibility of this committee is not to kowtow to industry stakeholders. The responsibility of this committee is to adhere to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and contend for Canadians. They are the ones who elected us. They are the ones who have entrusted us with the responsibility to advocate for them. For this committee to continue forward without taking this responsibility seriously is shame on us. To suggest that we should just continue ramming this legislation through, that we should just continue considering one clause after another without giving sober second thought to whether or not this legislation does indeed continue to abide by the charter is wrong. Mr. Michael Geist. He's a lawyer.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
One moment, please. Madame Lalonde, was that correct?
Yes,
Point of
Mr.
order, go
Chair.
ahead.
Listen, I was wondering, I would like to do the relevance of Mrs. Harder's comments, but also could you please read us back the what we're actually debating, Mrs. DeBrusen, about? If you could just read actually that motion to see the relevance of Mrs. Harder's towards her school versus what I understand Mrs. DeBrusen's motion was as amendment.
I'm going to do a couple things at this point. Thank you, Ms. Lalonde. Let me start with the second part. Ms. DeBrusen, what is she? She is amending the original motion as amended. I know that sounds confusing. Let me try that again. Ms. Harder had a motion. It was amended by Ms. McPherson. The amendment that was accepted already is now specific about the 10 days, maximum 10 days of doing that, which is what Ms. McPherson brought in. It was accepted. It was amended. Here we are to this point. Madame DeBrusen brought in several amendments, chief of which the first part to be negated that talks about the Charter Rights and Freedoms and down to Part C. In other words, suspend clause by clause consideration of C10, which Ms. DeBrusen would like to amend as well. Plus, she wants to bring back to explain in writing what the ministers, both the Minister of Justice, Minister of Canadian Heritage, would like to reply with this, and also to, as soon as possible, after clause by clause is completed. I hope that clears things up substantially. Ms.
Mr.
Harder,
Chair?
one moment, Mr. Brusen, I'll soon be finished. One thing I want to point out to Ms. Harder earlier was that I felt that she was drifting towards her original motion, which may lead to repetition from the first time that she debated. So I would ask her to stay within the confines, as was pointed out earlier, what came from what comes from Ms. DeBrusen's amendment, amending her motion. Now, Ms. DeBrusen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to point out, though, that I have sought to withdraw this amendment. So this entire debate about why the amendment is opposed makes no sense. If Ms. Harder is so opposed to it, I would suggest that perhaps we can just actually have it withdrawn. But I believe that she opposed that withdrawal.
Thank you, Ms. DeBrusen. I think we're veering into a debate a little bit. For the sake of clarity, yes, we earlier sought after UC. But anyway, let's go back to Ms. Harder. She has the floor.
Mr. Chair, I guess I would put forward the question. Without the amendment, or sorry, without the motion, of course, that I put forward, without that, now it houses, if you will, the amendment put forward by Ms. DeBrusen. So if we consider the amendment, in other words, just those key little phrases that say written instead of coming to committee, or as soon as possible instead of 10 days, if we just consider strictly those amendments, I guess all I would be talking about then is writing. I could talk about writing. I'm happy to talk about writing. Would we prefer that we talk about writing? Because that's one word in her amendment. And then as soon as possible is another
point of order.
Point of, okay,
I'm just
one moment.
No. Listen,
please.
I'm
No,
seeking
Ms. Harder,
clarification.
Ms. Harder, please.
Yes,
I'm asking you, number one, please don't yell into your microphone, because that's what happens when we elevate the conversation.
My apologies.
Number two, in a point of order, I have to cut it off at that and listen to the point of order. I do it for you, and now I have to do it for Ms. DeBrusen.
Yes. My apologies.
Just the point being that I would have thought the debate is why the.
Donc, moi, j'ai voulu retirer mon.
Sorry, one moment. I think we just had a translation issue at that point, or interpretation, sorry. I'm assuming it's clearing up now. Let's go back to Ms. Harder.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my apologies. I certainly didn't mean to raise my voice. I do apologize. My point is this, is that if we restrict ourselves only to the few words that make up the amendment, then the only words that I am permitted to debate are, quote, as soon as possible, and, quote, explain in writing, and, quote, by clause is completed. As soon as possible, after clause by clause is completed. Those are the only phrases that I would be permitted to debate or discuss. Mr. Chair, I think you would agree with me that that would not make for a productive conversation if those were the only phrases that I was allowed to discuss. So indeed, I do reference the motion that houses the amendment that has been brought forward, as is appropriate to do so, because it is the motion that gives the amendment context. Otherwise, we would all be wasting our time. I will continue. Mr. Geis is a legal professor, and he has said quite a bit about this piece of legislation. And he has raised some very serious, very significant concerns. He says this is a remarkable and dangerous step in reference to the removal of 4.1. He goes on to say, it is a remarkable and dangerous step in an already bad piece of legislation. The government believes that it should regulate all user-generated content, leaving it to regulator to determine on what terms and conditions will be attached to the videos of millions of Canadians on sites like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and hundreds of other services. The Department of Justice's own charter analysis of the bill specifically cites the exclusion to argue that it does not unduly encroach on freedom of expression rights. Without the exclusion, Bill C-10 adopts the position that a regular sets the rules for free speech online. What he is saying here is that with the removal of section 4.1, this bill in its current state would allow regulators to set rules around free speech, which then infringes upon section 2B of our charter. Again, what I'm asking for is that we push the pause button and that we give opportunity for the Justice Department, for the Justice Minister, to take a thorough look at this legislation as it currently stands and to determine whether or not it does in fact fall in line with the charter. That's not a lot to ask. That's not a lot to ask. I'm asking the elected officials around the table to give consideration to the rights and freedoms that are granted to Canadians. I'm asking the elected officials around this table to put the well-being of Canadians, their rights, before the interests of industry groups, before the interests of lobbyists, before the interests of friends. I'm asking this group to listen to the voices of experts, but not just to stop there, not just to stop with the voices of experts, but actually to refer this legislation even higher to the Department of Justice, the Justice Minister, to seek a formal legal opinion. Now, again, I'm not the only one asking for this. There are people who are far wiser than I am, who understand this legislation to a far greater extent than I do, who are advocating for this, including former CRTC commissioners, who I would imagine have a pretty good understanding of what is necessary and what would fall within the charter and what would not, and how we should go about this. And if they're raising a red flag, then I think it's incumbent upon all of us to do the same. So while Ms. DeBruzen would like to continue to consider this bill in its current state, and while there are a couple of members here tonight who would like to silence my voice and take away the opportunity that I have to speak to this important point, I would appeal to the committee that we take this bill and that we do allow it to undergo a thorough examination. The reason for this is because Canadians have concerns, and ultimately we are accountable to them. And again, I would say that it is incumbent upon all of us to make sure that the charter rights of Canadians are protected. One of the things that I find interesting is, of course, today there's been an attempt made to silence me. But in addition to that, what I've noticed is that whether it's on platforms of public media or in the House of Commons in question period, there is this attempt to silence. There is this attempt to incriminate those who would speak out about this legislation, or even those who would ask questions, maybe even just curious questions, but questions. Like, heaven forbid you would ask a question. Heaven forbid you would disagree. Fall in line. And I have an issue with that. So in the House of Commons, anytime a point has been raised, which has been verified by any one of the experts I listed off earlier, the Minister for Heritage calls it fake news. Well, really? It's fake news? The piece of legislation is right in front of us. Legal experts have spoken out. I don't know that that's fake news. You know, if questions are asked, if curiosity is had, if concerns are raised, the minister refers to those individuals as quote unquote extremists. Really? Like, since when did we become a country that doesn't allow for disagreements? Again, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects that dialogue. We should be able to have it here at this committee, but Canadians should also be able to have it out there on social media platforms in what they call the public square. But then, in addition to that, the Minister of Heritage went a level deeper, took a step lower, and launched attacks on me, my personal beliefs, my personal values, because I dared ask a question about this legislation. That's wrong. But again, I think it says a lot about the minister and his creation of this legislation and whether or not it does in fact respect the charter. I mean, the responses within the House of Commons certainly have not. So why would we trust that the legislation itself does? Again, the experts, they're calling for a review. They're saying this is dangerous. Their words. This is dangerous. Now, further to that, Ms. DeBruzen, you know, she said that, and the Prime Minister has as well, that that this legislation is crystal clear. It's totally clear. So basically saying like those Canadians and those experts that are raising concern with this legislation, well, they're just silly. They just lack intelligence. This legislation is crystal clear that it protects their freedom, crystal clear. But then Mr. Brusen comes today and talks about amendments that they would like to eventually move should they be given the opportunity to do so. The Heritage Minister, you know, he promised it's crystal clear, there's nothing to see here, but he's also going to amend it.
A point of order. Mr. Chairman, you probably know more than I do, and perhaps the clerk could clarify this, but it seems to me that in a debate like we are having, when we hear something repeated over and over again, then I think we should call on the member to come back to the subject. I think that Ms. Harder has clearly stated her arguments, and so I wanted to make that point, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Shampoo. And again, I'd like to remind everyone, let's try to stay within, try to keep one train of thought moving along in the same direction as far as your interventions are concerned. Ms. Harder, there were a few times, yes, that we risk repetition, but of course we do give a fair amount of flexibility here, as you know. You mentioned earlier about your motion. Yes, let me be clear. Speak about your motion by all means, as amended. But keep in mind, it's consequential to what germane to what we're talking about right now, which is the consequence of Ms. DeBruzen's amendment.
I have another point of order. There was no interpretation in French.
No interpretation in French. I will just keep talking for the moment until I look to you, Mr. Shampoo, to give me a thumbs up once you hear that you're receiving your translation or your interpretation in French. I want to welcome, we're good? Okay. Back to you, Ms. Harder. One more thing, just one more thing. Michael Geist, he's Dr. Geist. I'm sure he worked pretty hard for his PhD, and he would like to be known as Dr. Geist. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I accept your point. I very much accept your point. Excellent. Dr. Geist. My point is this. You cannot, on one hand, say that this legislation is crystal clear and you know, clearly protects individuals and their use of social media platforms. Meanwhile, simultaneously say that amendments are needed. and that you're going to bring further amendments in order to create further clarification. If it's already perfect, if it's already crystal clear, then it's good to go. But I think what is being admitted here is that this bill isn't perfect, that this bill isn't crystal clear in its protection of individuals and the content that they post online. So again, it is important that we put this forward for that charter review. Now, I think, Ms. DeBruzen would like to move that we have the charter statement at the end of this study. And I've been made aware that perhaps Mr. Housefather intends to move a similar motion, that we would move the review to the end of clause by clause. Ms. DeBruzen has indicated that she would like to bring forward some other amendments to the bill as we go through clause by clause. No. The review needs to be done now, because we're wasting our time if we talk about a piece of legislation that is so deeply flawed, and then we wait until the very end to actually get that review. We need that review now. Canadians deserve to know now. Canadians deserve to have us stand up for their charter rights now. That's not something that you put off. That's not something you wait for. That's not something you get around to when it's convenient. No. We're talking about Canadians' charter rights. We're talking about the supreme law of the land. We're talking about contending for Canadians. We're talking about the Canadians who elected us to be their representatives here in the House of Commons. We're talking about the Canadians who have entrusted us to put good legislation in place on their behalf. We're talking about people who trust us to protect as much of their freedom as possible, that we would be able to justify concretely every tiny ounce of freedom that we might legislate or chip away at. We better be able to justify that. Because if we are not able to justify that, if we are not able to show that it is with good reason, then we are on our way of becoming a propaganda machine. We are on our way of becoming like China. We are on our way to doing away with free press. We are on our way to doing entirely away with free speech, free expression, the ability to have your own opinion. Mr. Housefather shakes his head, but history tells me that I'm right. It's incumbent upon this committee to stop the clause by clause. Clause 4.1 was removed. It's an extremely important clause. This piece of legislation in its current state needs to go to the Department of Justice, to the Justice Minister, and it needs to be thoroughly reviewed. Now, Ms. DeBruzen would suggest that we need to be cooperative, that we need to collaborate. But the definition of collaboration that is being implied there is to do what she and perhaps the others on her team want us to do. Collaboration doesn't equal getting your own way. Collaboration means we have the discussion. It means we engage in robust debate. It means that we disagree. I mean, for crying out loud, this is how innovation works, folks. Someone puts forward a synthesis. Someone puts forward a hypothesis. Someone puts forward an antithesis, and then it synthesizes new information. This is how we grow. This is how we engage. This is how we become more sophisticated as a society. To shut that down, to ask us to turn off our minds, to fall in line, that's wrong. Now, as much as I've just spoken of what is required here at committee in terms of respecting the voices that are around this table and allowing for dissent to rightly take place here. The bill at hand is far more about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms held by the Canadian public. It's not just a piece of paper. It's theirs. Their rights, their freedoms. And again, it's incumbent upon us to protect them. I yield the floor.
Mr. Housefather.
Sorry,
Thank you.
point of order, Mr. Chair. Before Mr. Housefather
Mr.
begins,
Aitchison, sorry. Point of order. Go ahead.
can we have a quick bio break? We've been an hour now, and we usually take a quick break at about an hour. So,
Okay, Mr. Aitchison, we can do that, folks. Really, 5 minutes, and we'll start whether you're here or not. All right. pick up where we left off from this. Once again, we are now discussing the amendment put forward by Ms. de Bruzen. Mr. Housefather.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We talked, the previous speaker talked about respect. One thing that I've been very proud of as a member of this committee is that until today, I found that the members of this committee showed incredible respect to one another. There was never a time where someone asked to withdraw an amendment and unanimous consent was not granted. What happened today was Ms. Harder refused to grant unanimous consent for Ms. de Bruzen to withdraw an amendment that Ms. Harder is actually against, and then proceeded to speak for an entire hour, wasting the time of the committee, because we're not even going to get to the motion that Ms. Harder put before us, because there's an amendment from Ms. de Bruzen that Ms. de Bruzen doesn't even want us to debate any longer. It's totally not acceptable, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry. I'm very, very disappointed. And because I feel that this will just continue perpetually, and there's no purpose in debating Ms. de Bruzen's amendment because she does not even want it debated, I move to adjourn debate on Ms. de Bruzen's amendment.
Madam Clerk. Sorry, can everybody hear me now?
Yes, sir. Just to be clear,
Yep.
adjourning debate on the amendment effectively adjourns debate on the entire motion.
Correct.
So adjourning debate on Ms. Harder, on the de Brussen amendment on Ms. Harder's motion. Mr. Housefather?
Yes.
Madame Lalonde?
Oui.
Ms. de Brussen?
Yes.
Ms. Ian?
Yes.
Mr. Maloney?
Yes.
Ms. Harder? Or, sorry, Monsieur Reyes?
Oui, je
Vous
suis
êtes
de
là?
retour.
Désolée.
Donc, la réponse est non. Donc, c'est pas oui, je suis de retour, mais non. Je vote non.
Merci beaucoup. Mr. Aitchison?
No.
Mr. Shields? Sorry, Mr. Shields?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Waugh?
Non.
Monsieur Champoux?
Oui.
Ms. McPherson?
No.
Six yeas, 5 nays.
The debate is now adjourned. And as we pointed out earlier, that adjourns the motion itself and the debate itself. And now we go back to the other regularly scheduled programming, which was, of course, clause by clause consideration. Okay, everybody okay? I see a lot of hands up. Since we have done a reset here, I'm going to ask that everyone, there we go. Otherwise, I'm going to assume there's a point of order at some point. Is everybody, but we're now proceeding to clause by clause. Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Atchison, go ahead. Atchison, sorry.
Yeah, I'll make the point of order just because I just want to be sure I truly understood what just happened there.
Yeah.
Mr. Housefather moved to adjourn debate on Mr. Brusen's amendment. And by doing that, it actually adjourns debate and even a vote on Ms. Harder's original amendment?
No, it just adjourned the entire debate. We started off with a motion that was amended a motion. Then we got it, we picked it up. We brought back the debate we had earlier. Now we discussed Ms. de Brusen's amendment, which was on what we were debating in the last meeting. We started the debate again. What Mr. Housefather moved was the adjournment of the debate, which includes the motion and all that wrapped up within it. And now we go back to, as I mentioned earlier, regularly scheduled programming, which of course would be, one moment, Mr. Reyes, one moment.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
Carry on, sir.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Do I have the floor, Mr. Chair? Either interpretation was not good, or we are confused here, but what I understood when I voted is that Mr. Housefather asked for the adjournment on the motion of Ms. de Bruson and not the motion of the amendment of Ms. Harder, her motion that has been as amended by Ms. McPherson. So I'd like you to double check, but I didn't vote to put an end to adjourning the amending motion of Ms. Harder.
Madam Clerk, Madame Belmer, she did say that as a result of the vote, it would adjourn the debate of the motion. She did say that, Mr. So I hope that made it clear at the time. Go ahead, Mr. Reyes.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, no, it wasn't, because when Mr. Housefather spoke, I would like to look at this closer if necessary, but he asked for an adjournment on Mr. Bruson's amendment. That's how I understood it. That's how I voted. Unless Mr. Housefather wants to confirm or tell us exactly what he said. When the clerk repeated the adjournment on the motion, I thought we were talking about what Mr. Housefather said. Could Mr. Housefather confirm what he said? But I think I understood him clearly say that he wanted us to adjourn the debate on Mr. Bruson's amendment.
But as a consequence, the standing orders will call for an adjournment of the debate that also includes the motion, which is why our clerk said that to begin with. And since I'm fairly easy to get along with, would you like Mr. Housefather to respond?
I'm happy to do so. Peut-être en français, Monsieur le Président?
In French, Mr. Chair? For Mr. Reyes, you're right that I did say that I moved for an adjournment on the debate regarding Mr. Bruson's amendment, but Madam Clerk said right after, before we started the vote, that the consequence of this adjournment on the debate regarding the motion would adjourn the debate on the motion because you voted against my proposal. You probably would have voted against anything I moved. Point of order?
Monsieur le Président, j'avais aussi compris.
Yes, I also thought we were voting on the adjournment and not on Mr. Bruson's motion. I wasn't the only one.
But I think what the clerk said clearly, folks, was that we're debating as a consequence. These are the rules by which we govern ourselves. I'm sorry. And she said it quite clearly. So now we have to move on to the other stuff, which of course is our clause by clause consideration. Okay. I trust that's good with everybody now.
No, point of order.
It may not be
Monsieur
good, but
Président,
you get
point
the
d'ordre,
understanding.
j'aimerais une
Okay,
clarification.
one moment, please. I have Mr. Shields on a point of order, then I have Mr. Reyes.
So just to clarify for you, Mr. Chairman, I understand what you're saying, but the will of the group as the motion was made was for a vote on the motion of Mr. Bruson's amendment. Now, did the clerk have the possibility of saying that it was a vote on de Bruson's amendment? Did she have that possibility to say that?
I will ask the clerk to repeat what she had said prior to the vote, Madam Clerk.
I did clarify to the committee because there is no option to adjourn debate on the amendment without adjourning debate on the motion. That's why I clarified.
I guess, Mr. Chair,
Mr. Shields,
totally
Mr. Shields, one second. Once again, folks, can we not just randomly speak across the board? I might be a stickler about that, but I think it's for a good reason. Mr. Shields.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I guess what I would understood, and I understand now what you said and understand how you've ruled. It's just that it's not what I believe the people who are voting as committee
thought they were doing. So I
Okay.
understand your ruling. I
Right.
understand what the clerk had to say, but I don't believe it was the will of what a lot of people thought they were doing in the
Okay.
room.
Duly noted, Mr. Shields. Thank you. Mr. Reyes, you had a point of order.
Oui, j'aimerais.
Yes. I would like to understand, and perhaps Madam Clerk could explain the difference on the first vote, where Mr. Bruson asked to withdraw her motion. That took unanimous consent. And now we're following a different process without unanimous consent. Not only can she withdraw her motion, but interrupt the whole process. Excuse me if I need clarifications. I might not understand the rules enough, but logically, in my rational math teacher mind, I don't understand that sequence. So I would like to understand. Honestly, I voted without knowing what I was voting for.
Okay. Madam Clerk, since you're asking specifically the clerk, I'll let her respond if she wants to. Go ahead.
Absolutely, sir. Just to say that a motion, once it has been moved by a member, belongs to the entire committee. So therefore, a member does not have the right to unilaterally decide that they do not wish to move that motion anymore. As it belongs to the committee, unanimous consent of the committee is required to be able to withdraw it. If unanimous consent is not received, a decision must be taken on the amendment. It can be negatived, it can be adopted. So that is why unanimous consent is used for withdrawing a motion. What Mr. Housefather proposed was a dilatory motion and a motion to adjourn debate. While he did say a motion to adjourn debate on the amendment of Mr. Bruce, and the reason I clarified is because once you propose an amendment to a motion, the amendment must be disposed of before you can return to consideration on the motion. Therefore, the act of adjourning debate on the amendment also means the act of adjourning debate on the motion. I apologize if my precision was not more clear, but that is why I did say it before we proceeded to a vote, to be clear that we were also adjourning debate on Ms. Harder's motion at the same time.
Please don't look at this as something nefarious that we have cooked up between us. This is the way it worked. I'm sorry if the confusion was there. But now we have to move on, folks, to clause by clause. Now, I assume everyone received the newer version of G11.1. And I'm looking to Mr. Mela to confirm that that's where we are starting. Is that correct, Mr. Mela? No, you're still on mute, sir. I just need a quick confirmation.
Sorry, I had a problem with my computer here. So yes, we sent a new amendment from the government this afternoon called G11.1, and it would come just before BQ23, so it would be the first in line.
Okay. Does everyone have that? So G11.1. And Ms. DeBruzen, would that be you? Ms. DeBruzen.
It would be me.
Okay,
Thank you.
before you start though, Ms. DeBruzen, can I ask everyone to lower their hands everyone lower their hands now that I've recognized Madam DeBruzen? Thank you very much. Ms. DeBruzen.
So this was one of the amendments that I had mentioned earlier this evening. It deals with two separate issues. One, it creates, what it does is it restricts the CRTC's order powers for social media web giants to expenditures, discoverability of Canadian creators' programs, and financial information for web giants. So this is restricted order powers for the CRTC in respect of social media web giants specifically, and specifically the wording in respect of discoverability would be that in relation to online undertakings that provide a social media service, the discoverability of Canadian creators of programs. So this will add to the clarity when we talked about what the entire entire bill would look like as we were moving forward on this piece about social media web giants. This adds to that picture about the restricted CRTC powers. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Shields.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The department is with us tonight. I would love to have their opinion of what this particular addition means to it. If it is the crystal clear piece that the minister has been talking about for days, if this is the crystal that we're looking through, I would like to have the department respond as to exactly the meaning of this particular clause, which we have not had much time to deal with.
Okay, I think Mr. Ripley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question, Mr. Shields. I'd be happy to speak about what the effect of the amendment would be. So the amendment, what it would do is in section 9.1 of the bill, it would add an additional order making power for the CRTC that with respect to online undertakings that provide a social media service, so that order making power would only be with respect to social media services. It would give the CRTC the ability to make orders with respect to the discoverability of Canadian creators of programs. And in addition to that, what the amendment would do is it would clarify that with respect to social media services, only specific order making powers apply. And there are 3 of them that are listed. The first is a reference to an order making power that was introduced through BQ21, if I'm not mistaken. And so that is that speaks to expenditures to be made by persons carrying on broadcast undertakings for the purposes set out in section 11.1. In other words, the CRTC would have the ability to seek expenditures or financial contributions from social media services. The second order making power that would apply with respect to these services is the new one that Mr. Brusen alluded to or laid out with respect to the discoverability of Canadian creators. And the third power, Mr. Shields, speaks to 9.1, subparagraph 1, subparagraph J, which is information gathering powers that are provided to the CRTC. In other words, the CRTC would be able to seek certain information from online undertakings that are social media services in carrying out its duties. All the other order making powers listed in 9.1 would not apply to social media services. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Reyes?
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like for the officials to clarify what the difference is between this amendment from the government and the one we received this afternoon, or where 4.1 was removed. We feel like the government is trying to remedy for the shortfallings that were put forward last week, even though the minister and parliamentary secretary repeated that we were wrong, that users wouldn't be regulated by the CRTC. We're trying to understand the difference. Let me ask the question differently. What's the difference between this amendment and 4.1 that was removed, which was there originally for reasons that the department's officials understand why 4.1 was there from the beginning?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Reyes. As we discussed beforehand, Section 4.1 was intended to exclude programming that was uploaded on social media by someone who isn't affiliated to that social media. And the motion that was tabled by Ms. de Bruzen defines what regulatory tools under 9.1 can be used vis-à-vis social media.
And so there were the three powers that I just indicated in answering Mr. Shields' question. So those three powers will apply to social media, and the others in 9.1 will not apply. So I hope that that answers your question, Mr. Reyes.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I'll actually pass and go on to Mr. Shields, I guess. I was trying to find my points and all this stuff, and I have too many pieces of paper in front of me right now, and I'm getting a bit confused because this is all going in circles for me. So if you can come back to me, thanks.
Yep. Mr. Shields.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Back earlier, Mr. Brusen had was alluding to these things that she wanted to talk about earlier. I would request that she then again rephrase those things now that it's actually on the table, where from her point of view, I would like to hear what she says this is done compared to what had been here in 4.1, because we've had a lot of interesting things in the media, as she well knows. We've had the minister talking about it being crystal clear, and now it's going to be more crystal clear. And as you can see, we're already struggling with what's clear and what's not. But could you explain from your point of view, as the parliamentary secretary for Heritage, how you view this now as being more crystal clear and different from what it was before? I think you were starting to do that earlier, an hour and a half ago, but I would like to ask you if you would do that now.
I have Mr. Reyes next. I don't have Ms. de Bruzen in the queue, but I'm going to go to Mr. Reyes first.
Mr. Reyes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is a follow-up to the answer I got from Mr. Owens. Ms. de Brusen could perhaps help her when she has the floor, because as the parliamentary secretary, she should have some insight. But I want to mention Dr. Michael Geist, who has been quoted a number of times. He is an expert. Perhaps our witnesses or the officials or Ms. de Brusen could tell us what their expertise is, but certainly Dr. Geist has been very involved in research and work in the field of freedom of speech, and he says that regarding these two amendments, G13 and G11.1, that with respect to the content of users, this really does not address the issues. So I would like to hear from our officials or Ms. de Brusen. I'm not an expert in this field, but we are hearing from an expert that these amendments do not address the need. The government amendments do not protect Canadians that will upload content. So I'm trying to understand. We are receiving so many details. We have experts, we have university professors that are saying that this makes no sense. The government is refusing to have the Minister of Justice to have a ruling on whether, now that 4.1 has been eliminated, the charter is being respected. So I would like to know what is what. The only reason we're still talking about this is that the minister seems to be happy that 4.1 is no longer there, but why was it there in the first place? And now they are busy trying to fix the mess that they made. So I'm listening to everybody, but I would like to hear from the government side how they rebut the arguments by this university professor who's so knowledgeable in this field. So there are independent experts that say that freedom of expression is something we need to protect, and I'm very insulted. I hope that if the minister is listening, I hope that he will stop saying what he's been saying. We are defending a fundamental aspect of our democracy, which is freedom of expression. There are experts that are very much against this. There are Canadians that are concerned. We want more clarity, and the Liberals are trying to prevent us from getting that clarity.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I hear a lot of mention and discussion about experts, but I think that it's interesting that in this conversation, I don't hear the Conservatives referring to other experts as well who've been very much in support of the approach that we've taken, including Pierre Trudel and Monique Simard, who put a story put their opinion in Le Devoir recently called Pas de risque pour la liberté d'expression avec le projet de loi C10. And Janet Yale, who worked with Monique Simard on the Yale report, in that report, it was also recommended that social media be included in our modernization. So there are experts that perhaps Monsieur Reyes would also like to make as consider when he's talking about this. Pierre Trudel is a professeur à la faculté de droit à l'Université de Montréal. So
we have French law professors in Quebec.
As the original point, I will reiterate 2.1 remains and has already been confirmed as part of this bill, and specifically
Wait. Okay, one moment. We have an interpretation. Okay. From English to French, I gather. I'll just keep talking until you give me the thumbs up, and then we're ready to go. Ms. de Bruzen, as you were. You're on mute, Ms. de Bruzen.
Apparently, let me try third time's a charm. 2.1 was confirmed by this committee is in the bill and specifically excludes user-generated content. And then when we got to clause 3, in fact, the Conservatives themselves had proposed an amendment that would have, in fact, included social media web giants within the modernization of the Broadcast Act. That was CPC 5, I believe. But then we moved on. 4.1 was removed. And we have been very clear that when social media web giants are acting as a broadcaster, that they ought to be treated as a broadcaster, that there shouldn't be a free pass for social media web giants. What this part does, and I have been very clear when I've been talking about how we're proceeding through this bill, is that we move clause by clause because we're moving sequentially through the bill. But ultimately, the bill must be considered in its entirety, and that we have to, as we move through the different sections, we need to be talking about what the different sections entail. We are now in the order making section of the Act, the CRTC order making powers. And what this amendment that I am moving does is it shows clearly that the CRTC's order making powers would be restricted when we're talking about social media web giants who are acting as broadcasters. And the powers that would be restricted, as set out in this amendment, to expenditure obligations that had been put forward in BQ21 and the financial information being provided by the web giants and discoverability of Canadian creators programs. That is how it fits into the picture. It doesn't replace something else earlier in the Act. It is part of the review of the bill in its entirety when we're looking at the order-making powers. It just helps to clarify, as part of a full Act. And as we go, there are more amendments that all of the parties have proposed that continue to add so that we will have a fulsome bill once we have completed our clause by clause, which I am so happy we are finally at that point to be able to do. Thank you.
Mr. Shields.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just following up on that, some of the aspersions that have been placed on us saying that we're not interested in culture and protecting culture and being part of culture. I've got my membership for the National Art Center here. Do any other of the members have one for the National Art Gallery? I'm an MP that I don't live here, but I have a membership and I support the National Art Gallery in Ottawa. I'm also a regular attender of the National Art Center and plays that I do that with in Ottawa. I attend the Gladstone Theatre here in the Ottawa Little Theatre in Ottawa. So the aspersions, I feel taken pretty personally because back in our own communities, we go to it. But do you as MPs on both sides of this, are you members of the National Art Gallery? Or do you go to the National Art Center? I think that aspersion on us as conservatives saying that we don't support culture, I have a problem with that. But we've quoted many, many experts tonight, many experts. And I'd just like you to take just a little minute and listen to an expert that I would like to quote. It's through a letter that I've never heard from a constituent before that she sent me. Through my letters intended for the government of Canada as a whole, it is up to you, that my letter must find keeping. First, let me begin by apologizing for inept understanding of how complicated cogs and wheels that run the country I reside in. But much like I don't understand the intricacies of how a cell phone works, it doesn't mean that as a longtime user, I wouldn't be unable to critique its basic functions and form opinions on whether it is working for me. I can tell when my cell phone is working, and likewise, I can tell when it is broken. Equally as a lifetime resident of this beautiful country, I have felt failures of my government. I'll be honest with you, this is the first time in my life I have felt such a need to reach out to inform you of your failings. I don't wish to be rude or crass, simply poignant and direct. With this COVID-19 pandemic causing so much confusion and destruction in the world, I can't say that I know the right move. I cannot even comprehend the stress that must be for those who are expected to make those decisions. And now my government has placed broken the final straw. The thing I cannot sit idly by and allow is Bill C-10. If allowed to pass, my government would effectively have the legal rights to police social media content, produce and distribute approved agendas, have propaganda, and have full power of censorship. Slipping it through the crack of confusion during time of extreme COVID, citizens amidst the crumbling of political trust, my federal government decided now would be the time to gain control over media and internet content regulations. As I mentioned, I know little in the way of government operations, but this feels wrong. This feels dictatorial, and in fact, its most basic form and definition, Bill C-10, is non-constitutional. How can it possibly be allowed to pass when it goes against the basic rights of free speech and expression for subjects that self-same government was elected to protect? While my government claims those changes in Bill C-10 represent will only apply to professional content, this bill would effectively allow them to censor and regulate social media providers and users in Canada. I was shocked upon reading the words of Peter Menzies, the former CRTC commissioner, in an article available on National Post that said Bill C-10 doesn't just infringe on free expression. It constitutes a full-blown assault upon it and through it into the foundation's democracy. Finally, she says, with some other things, federally, voice must be respected. There must be consequences for breaking those constitutional rights by this trusted and elected leaders. I used to feel pride in being a Canadian. I still do feel pride to be a part of this land and country. But I do not feel proud being a Canadian citizen under this government. I feel swindled. I feel overlooked. I feel betrayed. And I call for change. Please restore my faith in this government.
Un
Stop
rappel au
the
règlement,
crumbling
Monsieur
and
le Président, s'il vous
constitutional
plaît.
rights.
A point of order. Mr. Champoux, I certainly don't like to interrupt my colleague, but I would like to know whether we are talking about 11.1 right now. I just would like that clarification.
Mr. Shields, we are, Mr. Champoux, yes, we are talking about G11.1. So, Mr. Shields, did I guess this correctly? You're just about done. As a quick reminder, if you're reading from a letter, you may want to slow down a bit more for the sake of our interpretation.
Sorry that we wanted to get through it and then hold up people on it, but it's the point that we've quoted many experts, and Mr. Brusen was again referring to experts on one side of opinions as we've maybe referred to different ones. I just wanted to bring the to light our citizens. They're our shareholders. They're our stakeholders. They are why we were here. And this is a constituent that I'd never heard from before, never written to an MP before. And I just wanted to bring that real voice as we've quoted experts. Mr. Brusen quoted experts in support of her amendment. And many experts have been quoted. So I wanted to quote what I believe is the true expert, are people who read media out there. She didn't follow me and get this from me. She read it in one of our major media publications. And that's how this person felt in this time of COVID and frustration, confusion, felt that C10 from what she read really was the last straw. So I just wanted to bring a voice of a person, a citizen, of how they felt that this piece of legislation personally affected them. It wasn't the experts we've quoted that we think are the doctors and academics. It was a citizen and how they felt. And I think that's so valuable that we must not forget. The experts are our voters. They're the citizens in our country, that how this legislation, they perceive it to affecting them in their place in this lives in this country. And I think that's a voice that hasn't been represented when we've talked about experts and this particular amendment. Thank you.
Mr. Aitchison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'm probably going to speak again to my state of confusion still. What I'm struggling with here, Mr. Chair, is that I understand that this amendment has been proposed by Mr. Brusen because of the removal of 4.1 and an effort to make things, I guess, more crystal clear than they were before, even with the removal of 4.1. So, I guess I remain frustrated by my confusion about the committee process, because I still think that what we ultimately need to do here is to actually get that new charter statement on where we're at, and I guess maybe what I would suggest is that perhaps these new amendments that Mr. Brusen has proposed maybe form part of our request to the Minister of Justice, because we had a charter statement based on C10 back in November before it came to our committee, and that was all well and good. Then we took out 4.1. All these questions got raised. We were told it was crystal clear. Apparently, it's not crystal clear, and now we're bringing this back. So, it begs the question: does this new amendment actually do what 4.1 did as effectively? Does it do it at all? I only got it earlier just earlier today. I don't think that's entirely fair for a rookie like me to truly get my head around it. And I'll be honest, Mr. Chair, I'm so used to municipal politics where we can disagree without being disagreeable. We get along and we're all about the good of our communities. I don't have a lot of trust right now. I feel like because I've been called an extremist because I've expressed some legitimate concerns from the people I represent about whether this bill does in fact infringe upon freedom of expression. And all of a sudden I wonder, am I not an extremist now? Am I just quite reasonable in my earlier request? Because now Mr. Brusen has brought this latest amendment. So am I not an extremist? Maybe I'm looking for an apology from Mr. Guilbeault for calling me names, but if I'm not an extremist and I have those, and my concerns were legitimate about the removal of 4.1, then I have to assume that everyone could understand that my concern remains on this latest amendment brought forward by Mr. Brusen, who last week was telling us that we were all crazy, and maybe not the word crazy, I apologize, but telling us that we were all overreacting, that conservatives were spreading misinformation about this situation, and now she's bringing an amendment forward to address those concerns, and I'm just supposed to sort of sit back and say, hey, great, you've addressed our concerns, without having a chance to really dig into this. As I say, I don't know who has the time to do the thorough analysis in the course of a couple of hours in the middle of a regular workday on Parliament Hill, but I certainly don't. I just think that it's kind of unfair to call us extremists one day, say it's crystal clear, then come back with the sub amendment that says, oh, this will make it more crystal clear and you have nothing to worry about. Just trust me, everything will be fine. I don't. I simply don't. And so I don't know if I can do this or not, Mr. Chair, but I would actually move that we actually put Ms. Harder's motion back on the table and send this to the Minister of Justice. Because I think that whether there's new amendments to replace 4.1 or not, we fundamentally changed this bill. Canadians are justifiably concerned. I think we can probably establish that I'm not an extremist, and that it's a legitimate question, and the Justice Minister should have a look at where things are at, including these latest proposals that have been thrown at us in the final hours, to see if, in fact, with these proposals, the charter statement that we had before is still valid, or if we need to make even more changes. I struggle with this, Mr. Chair. I and I'm not used to being called names by a cabinet minister, but if the concerns were legitimate enough to bring forward a new amendment, then I think that latest amendment that is being proposed should be reviewed by the Justice Minister as well, and we should take the time to do that, because I fundamentally believe, and I think you all do, that doing this right is far more important than doing it quickly. Canadians expect nothing less of us. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope my frustration wasn't too blunt.
Mr. Ryan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I asked a question not too long ago that should be forwarded to officials. And then we moved on to somebody else. I don't blame you, though. I think things are going very fast today. Ms. de Brusen took the floor and somebody answered. Michael Guys, who's a recognized expert and who is credible in this area, like, does he have credibility? So that's my first question. And then my complementary question, I wanted to ask the question to Ms. de Brusen. She did not answer, and that's why I referred to officials. I'm trying to refer to experts. Other sides tend to refer to other experts. We always try to find a compromise Is Michael Guys considered as credible by officials at the Department of Canadian Heritage? Yes or no?
You have two questions, one to department. The next one was, I think, to Ms. DeBruze, and I'll leave that there. If Ms. DeBruze wants to, that's her choice. But in the meantime, here's Mr. Ripley.
Merci pour la question.
Thanks for your question, Mr. Reyes. Unfortunately, I'm not here with the community to give an opinion on a question like this. I am here to support the work of the committee by providing advice and technical information on your work. There is certainly a difference between the impact of 4.1 that was withdrawn by the committee and the amendment that's tabled by Ms. DeBrusen. The difference being that without 4.1, social media that meet the definition of online enterprises are subject to the legislation. The effect of Ms. DeBrusen's amendment is to specify the powers of the CRTC that will apply to these social media enterprises with 4.1 for social media that we're only broadcasting social media programming, these powers will not apply. But now we have three powers, the powers that have been specified by Ms. DeBrusen that would apply to these enterprises. So in my opinion, this is the difference between the exclusion under 4.1 that existed before and the approach proposed by the government right now. Thank you very much. Can I ask my second question, Mr. Chair?
Parfait. Donc, par rapport à ce que vous venez de...
In light of what you just said, everybody must understand our situation right now, because you said that social media were affected or not by 4.1. 4.1 was withdrawn. Even the NDP and the Bloc opposed to this. Rachel Harder, through her motion, tried to find compromise to not delay the process unduly, and we wanted to have like a charter statement to know if to determine whether Canadians' freedoms were infringed upon. So you can imagine the frustration we are feeling right now. After a week, when we were attacked by the minister, saying that we were against culture, saying that users were not being subject to the new legislation, and now we realize that they are trying to buy peace through the back door with an amendment like this. We have lost confidence in the government. The government has confused people, trying to present us as opposed to culture. I would like to invite Ms. DeBrusen and Minister Guilbeault to talk to my constituents about all that I've done since the beginning to help and support the cultural sector. We have decided to build mega cultural center in my riding to promote culture, music. There's an organization, a local organization that does a lot of work in a lot of communities, including Indigenous communities. So being attacked like this is unacceptable. And we were attacked by the minister just because we tried to protect Canadians' freedoms. So in relation to Michael Geis, the University of Ottawa professor, he just wrote on Twitter a few minutes ago, quote, Ms. Dabrusin is talking about amendments that meet the concerns of the public as explained by the department. It's not even close to that. In fact, it creates a new power for the CRTC as for contents generated by user in the context of social media. So can you imagine how confused we are to see such an expert voicing his opinion? I didn't want to put officials in the hot seat and I know that they cannot really comment on experts' opinions, but when we're attacked by the government, when we want to defend freedom of expression and create partisanship in those attacks, it's not just us who are attacked, it's all of those experts behind us that do not have the same opinion as the government's experts.
They're attacking those experts, the Canadians who wrote not only to us, but to Liberal members of Parliament who received comments from their constituents who said it was a mistake. When I read Dr. Geist live on Twitter who says that's not true, that we're giving the CRTC more power for user-generated content, I don't know what foot to stand on anymore. The only thing we're asking for with Ms. Harder's motion is a legal opinion from the Minister of Justice, who's a Liberal. If before we start debating on all the amendments,
I am loath to interrupt you because I have this funny feeling you're on a roll. Just to clarify one thing, from here on in the future, if you want to ask a question to our officials, I'm assuming that once the question has been answered by the department, we're going to move on to the next person. I allowed you to do that because we never really clarified that rule. If you want to put what you want to say up front. Now, folks, that being said, we are now reached what we consider to be complicit as to the end time of this meeting. Now, we have a little bit of grace, but Mr. Reyes, if it's okay with you, we have two more speakers.
Non, Monsieur le Président, étant...
No, Mr. Chair, because you called me back to order. I respect your decision. I'd stop here. I would like for Ms. Dabrusin to say what she thinks about Dr. Geist, to know if he's reliable or not, so that we can make our own opinion after that. But I feel like I won't get an answer to my question anyways.
Maybe is because Mr. Waugh is up next. Mr. Waugh, and then I had Ms. McPherson. No longer? No,
I can
okay.
withdraw my, just in
Okay.
trying to make us go ahead.
You'll probably just become a champion of many. Mr. Waugh, if you could go ahead, but we are running short on time. Go ahead,
Yeah,
sir.
I expect I will be short. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank Mr. Ripley and the staff. It's been a difficult time. And I think this bill, because let's face it, it's been 3 decades since it's been looked at, is even more of an issue. But as a member of Parliament, I am so proud of our youth in this country. It was a week ago today that all papers in this country flagged 4.1. And within the last 7 days, I have never seen the outburst that I have seen from our youth in our country. I am so proud of those that use social media, and a lot of them, as we know, are the younger generation. You know, as politicians, we sometimes forget we're going to leave the broadcasting bill eventually in their hands because they are going to be the ones that own this. But I am so proud of all the young people in this country that have phoned, emailed, written, some of them here, even in Saskatoon, and more importantly to the minister, about their concerns about this bill. It wasn't until last Thursday it hit the fan. Yes, we've had our experts, and Mr. Bruce, and you had yours, and we've talked about Dr. Geist. The experts, though, are the citizens, and especially the young ones in this country. For the first time that I can remember in decades, they have stood up and said, enough. I want free expression. I want to have social media and use it the way I've been using it today. I do not want government, big government, looking over my shoulder. I was concerned when I asked the question to the chair of the current CRTC, Ian Scott, when he replied back, I need to go to Treasury Board. And now we're giving them more powers. And I know he said it in our committee, I can't do anything until I get a lot more money from the Treasury Board. So, and I know we're going over time here, but I just wanted to make it a point that I am so proud of our youth in this country. Sometimes as politicians, we forget who we serve. They reminded us the last 10 days that they're out there and they're watching us and they don't like what they see in this bill. That is evident with the feedback that the current government and all opposition members have received on this bill. Remember, we got 1 mouth and 2 ears. The ears are ringing because the youth in this country have signaled to us as politicians they don't like this bill. They do not like what is going on. We have an obligation to the youth of this country because they're going to be leading it very, very shortly. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
So we normally, folks, adjourn at the designated time through implied consent. Mr. Shields, I'm assuming that you're not consenting to that. Would you like to have a few remarks?
I'm moving to adjourn.
Oh, we have a motion to adjourn. Let me just, okay, Madam Clerk, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Motion to adjourn the meeting, just to clarify, Mr. Shields?
Yep.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Housefather?
Oui.
Madame Lalonde?
Oui.
Ms. de Brussen?
Yes.
Ms. Ian?
Yes.
Mr. Maloney?
Yes, and thank you.
Monsieur Reyes?
Yes, et merci.
Mr. Aitchison?
Yes.
Mr. Shields?
Yes.
Mr. Waugh?
Yes.
Mr. Champoux?
Oui.
Ms. McPherson?
Yes.
And we will see everyone tomorrow at 1 o'clock Eastern. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.